The morning of September 19th, 1944, Réchicourt-la-Petite, France. Through the dense fog that blanketed the fields of Lorraine, Lieutenant Edwin Leiper of Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, spotted something that made his blood freeze. 30 feet away, emerging from the grey mist like a steel phantom, the muzzle of an 88mm gun. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Behind it, the angular hull of a German Panther tank, then another, and another. Leiper's M18 Hellcat weighed 17 tons. The Panther before him weighed 45. His armour was barely 1 inch thick. The Panther's frontal armour was 4 3/4 inches of hardened steel. His 76mm gun struggled to penetrate a Panther from the front at any range. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity cannon could destroy his vehicle from over a mile away. By every technical specification, by every tactical manual, by every assessment of armoured warfare written since 1940, Lieutenant Leiper should have been dead within seconds. Yet in the 5 minutes that followed, his platoon destroyed 15 German tanks for the loss of 3 Hellcats. One of his sergeants, Henry R. Hartmann, personally knocked out 6 Panthers. By the time the Battle of Arracourt ended 3 days later, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 39 German tanks while losing only 4 M18s destroyed and 3 damaged. This is the story of how German tank crews, trained to dominate battlefields with superior firepower and armour, encountered something they never expected. Not another heavy tank to match their Tigers and Panthers shot for shot, but something far more unsettling. A tank destroyer that refused to fight by the rules they understood. One that could reach 55 miles per hour when their tanks could barely manage 25. One that appeared, fired, and vanished before their turrets could even traverse to respond. The Germans had prepared for many scenarios in 1944. They had not prepared for this. To understand why the M18 Hellcat proved so devastating against German armour, we must first understand what German tank crews expected when they rolled into France in September 1944. By late summer of that year, German doctrine had evolved through 5 years of continuous warfare. They had fought in the deserts of North Africa, the steppes of Russia, the hedgerows of Normandy. They had developed tactics refined through thousands of tank engagements, and those tactics rested on fundamental assumptions about how armoured warfare worked. German tank doctrine in 1944 emphasized 3 principles. First, superior firepower. The 88mm gun on the Tiger, I could penetrate the frontal armour of an American Sherman tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun could destroy a Sherman at similar distances. German crews knew their guns outranged and outpenetrated virtually every Allied tank gun they might face. Second, superior armour protection. The Tiger I's frontal armour was over 4 inches thick. Even late-model Panthers had frontal armour approaching 5 inches. German crews had grown accustomed to American 75mm shells, simply bouncing off their glacis plates at normal combat ranges. Third, tactical positioning. German doctrine by late 1944 increasingly emphasized defensive positions that maximized these advantages. Position tanks in hull-down positions. Engage at maximum range. Use superior optics to spot enemies before being spotted. Force the Americans to attack across open ground where German guns could destroy them at distance. These assumptions had been validated through brutal experience. At Normandy, German Tigers and Panthers had proven nearly immune to American tank guns when engaged frontally. A Tiger, I could sit stationary, behind a hedgerow, and destroy multiple Shermans in succession, with American shells simply ricocheting off its armour. The psychological impact was immense. American tankers had written home, describing how their guns couldn't penetrate German heavy tanks, how they watched their shells bounce off while German 88mm rounds tore through Sherman armour like paper. The Wehrmacht also understood American armoured doctrine by September 1944. American tanks operated in combined arms teams. They advanced with infantry support, They attempted flanking maneuvers, but those flanking attempts took time. A Sherman needed to physically move around a German tank's position, traversing terrain, potentially exposing itself to supporting weapons. German crews had learned to position themselves with mutual supporting fire. When one tank was threatened from the flank, another tank covered that approach. The Americans were predictable. They had superior numbers, yes, but predictable nonetheless. The M18 Hellcat, however, represented something entirely outside this framework. Its development had begun in December 1941, when the Ordnance Corps issued requirements for a fast tank destroyer. The driving philosophy came from Lieutenant Colonel Andrew David Bruce, who commanded the Tank Destroyer Center. Bruce believed speed and mobility mattered more than armor protection. His vision was simple: don't absorb enemy fire, don't allow enemy fire, move too fast for the enemy to target effectively. This philosophy produced the most unusual armored vehicle of World War II. The M18 mounted a 76mm M1A2 gun in an open-topped turret. That turret sat on a chassis weighing only 17.7 tons. For comparison, a Sherman weighed 30 tons, a Panther weighed 45 tons, a Tiger I weighed 56 tons. The M18 wasn't even armoured like a tank. Its thickest armour was 1 inch, the sides were barely half an inch, and an anti-tank rifle could penetrate it. But that minimal weight served one purpose: speed. The M18 was powered by a Continental R975C4 radial engine. This was an aircraft engine, producing 400 horsepower. That massive power-to-weight ratio, combined with an innovative Torque-matic automatic transmission and torsion bar suspension, produced something unprecedented. The M18 Hellcat could reach 55 miles per hour on roads. In testing at Buick's facilities, fitted with special tracks on a banked oval course, one M18 reached 74 miles per hour. Nothing else on tracks could approach that speed. Not the Sherman at 30 miles per hour maximum, not the Panther at 25 miles per hour, certainly not the Tiger at 24 miles per hour. The M18 first saw combat in Italy in spring 1944. 5 prototype T-70 models were sent to the Anzio beachhead. Initial reactions were mixed. Crews loved the speed. They loved how quickly the turret traversed. M18's turret could rotate 360 degrees in 19 seconds. A Tiger I's turret took 60 seconds. That difference was life or death in combat. Spot an enemy, traverse to engage, fire, and relocate before return fire arrived. But crews were terrified of the thin armor. Living inside what amounted to a tin can while German 88mm shells were flying felt suicidal. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st U.S. Army, initially refused to accept M18s for the Normandy invasion. He preferred the M10 tank destroyer with its thicker armor. He wanted the new M36 tank destroyer with its 90mm gun that could penetrate any German tank. Only 3 tank destroyer battalions received M18s for Normandy. All 3 were assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton understood speed. Patton appreciated vehicles that could exploit breakthroughs and pursue rapidly. The 603rd, 704th, and 705th Tank Destroyer. Battalions came ashore in late July 1944, equipped with 36 M18 Hellcats each. For the first 2 months, these battalions saw relatively little action in their intended role. They escorted supply convoys. They provided direct fire support for infantry. The war in France during late summer 1944 was fluid. The Germans were retreating. American armored spearheads were advancing rapidly through relatively undefended territory. There were few massed panzer counterattacks where tank destroyers could demonstrate their specialized capability. Then September arrived. And with September came the German 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive in Lorraine. By early September 1944, Patton's Third Army had advanced farther east than any other Allied force. The Third Army's XIIFIA Corps had crossed the Moselle River near Nancy and pushed beyond. The 4th Armoured Division, under Major General John S. Wood, was the spearhead. Wood's division included. Combat Command A, led by Colonel Bruce C. Clark. Clark's force centered on Arracourt, a small town in Lorraine about 30 miles east of Nancy. His command consisted of the 37th Tank Battalion with its Sherman tanks, the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, several artillery battalions, and Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion under Captain Thomas J. Evans. Clark's position by mid-September was exposed. His force formed a salient, extending into German-held territory. His flanks were thinly held. His main strength was concentrated around Arracourt itself. This was textbook German opportunity. A isolated American formation, extended supply lines, limited reinforcements available. If the Germans could mass armor and strike quickly, they could cut off Clark's command, perhaps destroy it entirely, and eliminate the American bridgehead across the Moselle. The German 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, assembled substantial forces for exactly this purpose. The main striking force consisted of the 11th Panzer Division and two newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th. These brigades represented Hitler's emergency response to mounting armor losses. They were hastily organized units built around new Panther tanks with fresh crews but little unit training. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone fielded 36 Panther tanks and 11 Panzer IV, 70 tank destroyers. The 11th Panzer Division, while experienced, had been rebuilt after heavy losses and fielded additional Panthers and Panzer IVs. In total, the 5th Panzer Army assembled approximately 182 tanks and 80 self-propelled assault guns. Against this force, Clark's Combat Command A had approximately 70 tanks and 12 M18 Hellcats. The Germans outnumbered the Americans more than 3-1 in armored vehicles. More importantly, the German force consisted primarily of Panthers, tanks that were technically Kato, superior to American Shermans in almost every measurable way. The Panther tank in September 1944 represented the culmination of German tank development. It mounted a 75mm KWK 42 litres, 70 gun that could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. Its frontal armour, sloped at 55 degrees, was effectively 6 inches thick. A Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther frontally except at point-blank range. Even the newer 76mm gun on late-model Shermans struggled against Panther armour beyond 1,000 yards. The Germans knew this. Every crew in the 113th Panzer Brigade understood their technical superiority. Their commanders had trained them with this knowledge. Your tank is superior to anything the Americans field. Your gun outranges theirs. Your armour is proof against their weapons. Maintain formation. Advance steadily. Destroy American tanks at distance before they can close to effective range. This was doctrine. This was proven through years of combat. This was reality. What the German tank commanders did not know, could not have known, was that doctrine and reality were about to diverge in a 5-minute engagement that would challenge every assumption about armoured warfare they had internalized over 5 years of war. The German attack began on September 18th, 1944, against Combat Command Reserve at Lunéville. This was a probing attack by the 111th Panzer Brigade. The Americans, reinforced by elements of the 4th and 6th Armoured Divisions, beat back the assault. 24 German tanks were destroyed, but this was merely preliminary. The main German force was moving north, bypassing Lunéville entirely, heading for Clark's exposed position at Arracourt. The night of September 18th into 19th was tense at Combat Command A headquarters. Reports indicated major German activity. The exact location and strength were unclear. Clark adjusted his positions. He placed his forces along likely avenues of approach. Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was positioned on high ground north of Arracourt. One platoon was held in reserve at the command post. The 37th Tank Battalion's Company C was outposted at the crossroads near Leiper, about 3 miles northeast of Arracourt. Dawn on September 19th broke grey and foggy. Visibility was less than 75 yards. This was the kind of weather that negated every German advantage. Superior gun range meant nothing when you couldn't see beyond a few dozen feet. Superior optics were useless in dense fog. The Germans were advancing blind into an American defensive position, whose exact dispositions they didn't know. At approximately 7 a.m., Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, positioned near Les Ayes, made first contact. Through the fog appeared a Panther tank, barely 75 yards away. The American Shermans fired immediately. The Panther and 2 additional German tanks were destroyed within seconds. The remaining Panthers turned south, retreating through Moncourt. But this was merely the first probe. The main German assault was developing farther south, aimed directly at Réchicourt-la-Petite and the exposed flank of Combat Command A's headquarters position. Colonel Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion had 1 company at Les Ayes. Captain Evans had his M18s positioned on high ground. Between the German columns and American headquarters stood very little. At 7:30 a.m., Captain William A. Dwight, liaison officer between Combat Command A and the 37th Tank Battalion, was driving his jeep between command posts when he spotted a German column approaching from Moncourt. He immediately returned to report. Colonel Clark grasped the danger instantly. The Germans were moving to flank Abrams' position at Les Ayes. If they succeeded, they would overrun Combat Command, a headquarters. Clark moved to where Captain Evans's Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had established their position. This was the moment, the theoretical encounter that Tank Destroyer doctrine had envisioned. Mass armor attacking, tank destroyers positioned to counterattack the assault. But the reality looked nothing like the doctrine. Clark didn't have time to mass his forces. He had 12 M18s in position, with 1 platoon in reserve. Against them was coming the bulk of the 113th Panzer Brigade, 30 or more Panthers and supporting tanks. Lieutenant Leiper commanded 3rd Platoon of Company C. His orders were simple: move toward Réchicourt, find the German column, engage. Leiper led his 4 M18s northeast through the fog. Visibility remained terrible. The crews were driving nearly blind. Then, suddenly, at approximately 8 a.m., they saw it. Tank gun muzzles emerging from the fog. Panthers, multiple Panthers. At a range of barely 30 feet, every instinct and every tactical manual said Leiper should be dead. A Panther could destroy an M18 with a single shot at any range. The M18's thin armor would not even slow the Panther's 75mm armor-piercing round. At 30 feet, the Panther crew couldn't miss. The engagement should have been over before it began. But the fog that had blinded Leiper had also blinded the Panthers. The German crews were buttoned up, visibility through periscopes nearly zero. They were advancing in column formation, trusting that their superior firepower would handle any opposition once the fog cleared. They were not expecting contact, and they certainly weren't expecting what happened next. Leiper's platoon opened fire simultaneously. 5 M18s, firing 76mm armor-piercing rounds. At 30 feet, even a 76mm gun could penetrate Panther side armor. The first 3 Panthers were destroyed within seconds. The 4th Panther, crew panicking, retreated behind the wreckage of an American bomber that had crashed in the field. Leiper's gunner switched to high-explosive shells and set the bomber wreckage on fire. The Panther was not observed to escape. A 5th Panther appeared from Les. It was destroyed before it could bring its gun to bear. 5 Panthers destroyed in minutes. But Leiper's platoon wasn't finished. The fog began to lift slightly. German tank commanders, hearing the engagement, began buttoning up and preparing for combat, but they were in column formation on a road. Perfect targets. Leiper's M18s, positioned on slightly elevated ground with clear fields of fire once the fog lifted, had achieved exactly what Tank Destroyer doctrine envisioned. They had caught a massed armor attack in the open. Over the next hour, as visibility improved, the engagement developed into a running battle. The M18s would fire, destroy a tank, then immediately relocate. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Their speed allowed them to change positions faster than German. Gunners could traverse and aim. A Panther's turret took 60 seconds to rotate 360 degrees. An M18's turret took 19 seconds. That 41-second difference meant M18 crews could spot a threat, engage, destroy, and be repositioning before a Panther crew finished traversing to return fire. The speed difference was even more dramatic. When an M18 needed to change positions entirely, not just relocate a few dozen yards, it could accelerate to 30 miles per hour within seconds. A Panther needed substantial time to accelerate to its maximum 25 miles per hour. By the time a Panther crew realized an M18 had relocated, acquired the new position, traversed the turret, and prepared to fire, the M18 was already gone. From the German perspective, they were fighting ghosts. Targets would appear, destroy a tank, and vanish before effective return fire was possible. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. They had trained for tank combat. They understood how engagements developed. Spot, enemy, range, fire. If the enemy returned fire, use your superior armor to absorb hits while your superior gun destroyed them. But the M18s weren't absorbing hits. They weren't even there to be hit. The Panthers had superior guns, superior armor, superior optics. None of it mattered when the target refused to remain stationary long enough to be engaged. By noon on September 19th, Lieutenant Leiper's platoon had destroyed 15 German tanks. They had lost 3 M18s. Elsewhere along the line, other elements of Company C were achieving similar results. 2nd Platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Berard, engaged Panthers approaching from Ley. They destroyed 5 German tanks without sustaining a single casualty. The only damage Berard's tank suffered was 2 bogey wheels knocked off his track by a glancing hit. The action wasn't without cost for the Americans. 3 M18s from Leiper's platoon were destroyed. Each loss was catastrophic. When an M18 was hit, its thin armor provided no protection. Crew casualties were high, but the tactical exchange ratio was devastating for the Germans. The 113th Panzer Brigade had lost most of its combat power in a single morning. They had achieved nothing. American positions remained intact. Combat Command A headquarters was never threatened. The German failure wasn't simply about technology. It was about expectations colliding with reality. The 113th Panzer Brigade had advanced expecting to encounter Shermans in defensive positions. They would engage at 1,000 yards with their superior guns. They would absorb return fire with their superior armor. They would systematically destroy American tanks through firepower superiority. None of this happened. Instead, they encountered an entirely different kind of warfare, an opponent that refused to fight by the established rules. The Germans brought superior firepower to a battle where firepower wasn't the deciding factor. They brought superior armor to a battle where not being hit mattered more than absorbing hits. They brought methodical, systematic doctrine to a battle where speed and initiative trumped systematic approaches. The engagement at Réchicourt-la-Petite on the morning of September 19th, 1944, lasted approximately 5 hours. By early afternoon, the 113th Panzer Brigade had effectively ceased to exist as a combat-effective force. Colonel Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion claimed his Sherman units destroyed 29 additional tanks during the day. Total German losses approached 50 tanks destroyed in a single day. American losses were 3 M18s and a handful of Shermans. That evening, German commanders assessed what had happened. They had numerical superiority. They had technical superiority. They had experienced commanders and crews trained in panzer tactics refined through 5 years of war. They had lost decisively to a force they outnumbered 3-1. The reports going up the chain of command struggled to explain the defeat. The fog had limited visibility. American artillery had been effective. American air power had intervened, once visibility improved. All true. But none of these factors explained the central paradox. How had American tank destroyers with guns that could barely penetrate Panthers frontally destroyed dozens of Panthers while suffering minimal losses themselves? The answer wasn't in the reports. The answer was in the fundamental assumptions German doctrine made about how armored combat functioned. Those assumptions were based on 5 years of experience, thousands of tank engagements, detailed after-action reports, careful analysis, and all of it had been rendered largely irrelevant by a vehicle that simply operated outside the parameters the doctrine assumed. The Battle of Arracourt would continue for 10 more days. The Germans would launch additional attacks with the 11th Panzer Division and bring up reinforcements. They would attempt to learn from the September 19th disaster. They would try different approaches, different tactics. None of it would fundamentally change the outcome. By the end of September, the 5th Panzer Army would have lost 86 tanks destroyed, 114 damaged or broken down, with only 62 operational. Combat Command A would have lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's Company C, equipped with M18 Hellcats, had achieved something unprecedented in armoured warfare. They had defeated a numerically and technically superior force through a combination of speed, initiative, and tactics that their opponents simply could not counter. The Germans had prepared for many scenarios. They had encountered British Cromwells and Churchills. They had faced Soviet T-34 seconds and KV-1 second. They understood how those tanks fought. They knew their capabilities and limitations. The M18 Hellcat was something different. It represented a philosophy of armoured warfare that German doctrine had not anticipated, and in the fog-shrouded fields around Arracourt, that philosophical difference proved decisive. The implications would extend far beyond a single battle in Lorraine. But first, we must understand exactly how German tank crews experienced these encounters. What went through the mind of a Panther commander when he saw an M18 for the first time? How did German tactical doctrine attempt to adapt, and why did those adaptations prove largely ineffective? The story of the M18 Hellcat and the German tanks it hunted is ultimately about more than technical specifications and tactical doctrine. It's about what happens when carefully constructed assumptions about warfare meet an approach that operates entirely outside those assumptions. It's about the difference between fighting the enemy you expected and fighting the enemy you encountered. The Germans expected to fight American Shermans in positional warfare. They got M18 Hellcats in fluid, high-speed engagements. That difference cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of tanks and contributed to the eventual collapse of German defensive positions in eastern France. But the full story requires understanding both sides of this equation. The American development of tank destroyer doctrine, the specific tactical training M18 crews received, the German perspective on American armor throughout 1944, and the specific engagements where these forces collided with such one-sided results. Each piece of this puzzle reveals something important about how warfare evolves when new capabilities emerge that existing doctrine cannot adequately address. The German tank crews of the 113th Panzer Brigade were not inexperienced soldiers. Many had fought in earlier campaigns. They had trained extensively with their new Panther tanks. They understood the technical capabilities of their vehicles. But that knowledge created its own form of blindness. They knew their 75mm guns could penetrate any American tank at 2,000 meters. They knew their frontal armor could withstand hits from American 75mm guns. They knew these facts with absolute certainty, because those facts had been demonstrated repeatedly in combat since the Panthers first appeared in 1943. This certainty shaped how they approached combat. When advancing into a combat zone, Panther crews moved with confidence. They maintained formation. They scanned for targets at distance. They prepared for the kind of engagement they had trained for. Spot enemy tanks. Range them. Fire first. Use superior firepower to destroy the enemy before they could close to effective range. If the enemy did fire, your armor would protect you long enough to destroy them. This wasn't arrogance. This was rational calculation based on demonstrated capabilities. The morning of September 19th shattered that calculation. From the perspective of the Panther crews advancing through the fog toward Réchicourt, the engagement made no sense. They were advancing in column, visibility was poor, but this was manageable. Once the fog lifted, their superior optics would spot American positions first. They would engage methodically. But the fog never became an advantage. Instead, at ranges where visual identification was nearly impossible, muzzle flashes appeared. Shells struck Panther side armor. Panthers began exploding. Crews bailed out into the fog. Those still operational attempted to traverse turrets to engage, but targets had already moved. Return fire struck empty positions. More muzzle flashes appeared from different locations. More Panthers were hit. The engagement wasn't following any pattern the German crews recognized. A Panther tank commander's greatest advantage was situational awareness. The Panther had excellent optics. The commander had a cupola with periscopes providing 360-degree visibility. But those advantages required time to exploit, time to scan, time to identify targets, time to communicate with the gunner, time to traverse the turret, time to range and fire. The M18 wasn't allowing that time. By the time a Panther commander spotted an M18, communicated its position, and began turret traverse, the M18 had already fired and was relocating. The fundamental problem was speed differential, not just physical speed, though that mattered enormously, but speed of decision-making and execution. An M18 crew could decide to relocate and be in motion within seconds. The lightweight and powerful engine meant instant acceleration. The Panther required longer to accelerate. Its 45-ton weight meant building momentum took time. An M18 could be at 30 miles per hour before a Panther reached 15 miles per hour. In fluid combat, that difference was insurmountable. German after-action reports from Arracourt struggled to articulate what had happened. They noted the fog. They noted American artillery. They noted tactical errors by the 113th Panzer Brigade's commanders. The 113th had advanced without adequate reconnaissance. They had moved in column formation on roads rather than deploying into combat formation earlier. They had failed to establish mutual supporting positions. All true, but these observations didn't explain the larger pattern that would repeat throughout the battle. Even when German commanders corrected these tactical errors, even when Panthers deployed properly in defensive positions with good fields of fire and mutual support, the M18s remained problematic. The issue wasn't simply tactical mistakes. It was that the M18 operated at a tempo that German doctrine didn't anticipate. German defensive doctrine assumed that attackers would need time to advance, time to identify defended positions, time to maneuver into attack positions. That time allowed defenders to engage at range with superior guns. The M18s compressed that timeline. They would appear at high speed, fire from unexpected angles, and be gone before effective return fire was possible. This wasn't the methodical, systematic combat that German doctrine prepared crews for. This was something closer to cavalry warfare. Rapid strikes, fluid positions, initiative over firepower, speed over armor. The Germans had technical superiority in individual vehicle capabilities. The Americans had tactical superiority in how those vehicles were employed. The engagement on September 19th was merely the beginning. Over the following 10 days, the Battle of Arracourt would see repeated clashes between German armor and American forces. On September 22nd, the 11th Panzer Division launched attacks against Juvisy and Lise. These were more carefully coordinated than the 113th Panzer Brigade's disastrous advance 3 days earlier. The 11th Panzer had experience. They deployed properly. They attempted to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed the 113th. In the pre-dawn hours, German Panzer Grenadiers with 12 supporting tanks attacked screening positions held by Stuart light tanks of D Troop, 25th Cavalry Squadron. 4 Stuarts were quickly destroyed. The Germans were gaining ground. Then M18s from B Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, responded. They knocked out 3 Panthers before withdrawing. This was the pattern the Americans were developing. Engage, inflict casualties. Withdraw before the enemy could mass fire against you. Don't defend fixed positions. Use mobility as armor. The fighting on September 22nd developed throughout the day. German forces pushed toward key terrain. American forces, including both Sherman tanks and M18 Hellcats, contested each advance. The M18s operated as highly mobile fire brigades. When German armor appeared in one sector, M18s would race to that position, engage from flanking angles, then relocate to another, the threatened sector. Their speed allowed them to be everywhere German commanders didn't expect them. By afternoon, American fighter bombers entered the battle as the fog lifted. P-47, Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group struck German armor concentrations. The combination of M18s attacking from unexpected angles and aircraft striking from above created an impossible situation for German commanders. They couldn't maintain formation against air attack, but dispersing made them vulnerable to M18s picking off isolated tanks. The tactical problem had no good solution. The fighting on September 29th marked the final major German effort. Panthers pushed against Hill 318 near Arracourt itself. American forces, including Sherman tanks and M18s from multiple companies of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, defended the position. The Germans attempted a coordinated assault. American artillery disrupted their formations. M18s engaged from flanking positions. When P-47 seconds appeared overhead, the German assault collapsed. 23 tanks were lost in the hill, 318 engagement alone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the end of September 1944, the 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive had completely failed. Of 262 tanks and assault guns committed to the battle, 86 were destroyed. 114 were damaged or had broken down, and only 62 remained operational. The 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, operating M18 Hellcats, had achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armoured unit in the European theatre. These numbers tell part of the story, but they don't capture the psychological impact on German tank crews. For years, German panzer forces had operated with confidence born from technical superiority. They had better guns than the British in North Africa. They had better armour than the Soviets early in the Russian campaign. Even when the Soviets introduced the T-34 and later the IS-2, German crews could rely on superior optics, better training, and careful tactical employment to maintain effectiveness. Against the M18, technical superiority provided no meaningful advantage. The M18's 76mm gun could penetrate Panther side and rear armour at combat ranges. That meant German crews couldn't simply rely on armour protection. They had to avoid being hit, but avoiding hits required knowing where the threat was. The M18's speed made that knowledge ephemeral. By the time a Panther crew identified an M18's position, that position was already outdated. The Battle of Arracourt demonstrated principles that would prove relevant beyond that specific engagement. Tank Destroyer doctrine, as conceived by American planners, emphasized mobility and ambush tactics. The M18 was the purest expression of that doctrine. Strip away protective armor, maximize speed and firepower. Don't absorb enemy fire. Don't be where the enemy expects to fire. The doctrine had been controversial. Many officers preferred heavier vehicles with more protection. The M10 tank destroyer with its thicker armor was more popular with some units precisely because it felt safer. But Arracourt validated the speed over armor philosophy. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's success prompted other units to request conversion to M18s. By December 1944, 9 Tank Destroyer Battalions operated Hellcats. They saw action during the Battle of the Bulge, where M18s of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion helped defend Bastogne. On December 25th, M18s knocked out 27 German tanks at the cost of 6 Hellcats. The pattern from Arracourt repeated. German armor attacked. M18s engaged from flanking positions. German formations were disrupted before they could mass combat power effectively. The Germans attempted to adapt. Tactical instructions emphasized maintaining security against flanking attacks. Units were ordered to deploy reconnaissance elements more aggressively. Tank destroyers and anti-tank guns were positioned to cover approaches that fast American vehicles might use. But these adaptations required resources and time that Germany increasingly lacked. By late 1944, fuel shortages limited German mobility. Crew quality was declining as experienced tankers became casualties. The Panthers and Tigers remained formidable weapons, but the crews operating them were often inadequately trained. The M18, conversely, benefited from crew quality. Operating a Hellcat effectively required skill and initiative. Commanders needed to read battlefields rapidly. Drivers needed to handle a vehicle capable of 55 miles per hour on uncertain terrain. Gunners needed to engage targets during brief firing opportunities. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had trained extensively with their vehicles. They understood the M18's capabilities and limitations. They had developed tactics that maximized strengths while minimizing vulnerabilities. Those tactics emphasized aggressive reconnaissance and rapid engagement. M18 platoons wouldn't wait for enemy armor to attack fixed positions. They would patrol aggressively, seeking contact. When they found enemy armor, they would attack immediately from the most advantageous angle available. Hit, relocate, hit again from a different angle. Never allow the enemy time to organize a methodical response. Keep the tempo high. Force the enemy to react rather than act. This approach worked because the M18's mechanical reliability supported sustained operations. The Continental radial engine, despite being an aircraft power plant adapted for ground use, proved remarkably dependable. The automatic transmission reduced driver fatigue during long operations. The torsion bar suspension allowed high-speed movement across rough terrain without excessive wear. German tanks, particularly late-war Panthers and Tigers, suffered increasing mechanical problems. Complex engineering and declining manufacturing quality meant breakdowns were common. An M18 platoon could maintain high operational tempo for days. A Panther company might have half its vehicles deadlined for mechanical issues within a week of intensive operations. This approach worked because the M18's mechanical reliability supported sustained operations. The Continental radial engine, despite being an aircraft power plant adapted for ground use, proved remarkably dependable. The automatic transmission reduced driver fatigue during long operations. The torsion bar suspension allowed high-speed movement across rough terrain without excessive wear. German tanks, particularly in late-war Panthers and Tigers, suffered increasing mechanical problems. Complex engineering and declining manufacturing quality meant breakdowns were common. An M18 platoon could maintain high operational tempo for days. A Panther company might have half its vehicles deadlined for mechanical issues within a week of intensive operations. The broader statistical record of M18 Hellcat operations validates the Arracourt pattern. Throughout the European campaign, M18-equipped tank destroyer battalions achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of 2.4 to 1 overall. In Europe specifically, the ratio was 2.3 to 1. These numbers exceeded the performance of any other American tank or tank destroyer. The M18 claimed 526 kills total, 498 in Europe, 17 in Italy, 11 in the Pacific. These weren't inflated claims. Post-war analysis of combat records, including German documentation, confirmed the general accuracy of American kill credits. For context, the M10 tank destroyer achieved lower kill ratios despite having thicker armor. The M36, with its powerful 90mm gun, also posted lower ratios. The Sherman tank, backbone of American armored forces, had substantially lower kill-to-loss figures. The M18's combination of speed, firepower, adequate for flanking shots, and tactics emphasizing mobility over protection proved more effective than heavier, more heavily armed alternatives. This effectiveness came despite significant limitations. The 76mm M1A2 gun on the M18 could not reliably penetrate Tiger or Panther frontal armor at normal combat ranges. Standard armor-piercing ammunition would bounce off a Panther's glacis plate even at close range. The introduction of high-velocity armor-piercing rounds in late 1944 improved penetration, but HVAP ammunition was chronically scarce. Most M18 crews fought the entire war with standard ammunition. The open-topped turret left crews vulnerable to artillery fragments, grenades, and small arms fire. Every engagement carried the risk that shrapnel would wound or kill crew members who had no overhead protection. The thin armor meant any penetrating hit was catastrophic. When an M18 was struck by an 88mm round from a Tiger or a 75mm round from a Panther, the vehicle typically brewed up instantly. Crew casualties were severe. There was no walking away from most hits. Yet M18 crews understood this going in. They knew their vehicle was a glass cannon. The trade-off was explicit. You're not armored. You're not going to absorb hits. So don't get hit. Use your speed. The crews who internalized this philosophy thrived. Those who tried to fight the M18 like a tank, trading shots with German armor, typically didn't survive long. The vehicle demanded a specific tactical approach. Crews who mastered that approach achieved remarkable results. The German experience of fighting M18s contributed to broader German assessment of American armored forces. German after-action reports throughout late 1944 increasingly noted American tactical flexibility. American units would shift tactics based on terrain and situation. In the Normandy hedgerows, American armor fought methodically with infantry support. In the rapid exploitation across France, American armor raced forward with minimal infantry coordination. Around Arracourt, American tank destroyers fought like light cavalry, appearing and vanishing unpredictably. This flexibility frustrated German operational planning. German doctrine emphasized thorough planning and systematic execution. When plans worked, German forces were devastatingly effective. But when plans encountered unexpected situations, adaptation was slower. Lower-level German commanders had less initiative training than their American counterparts. German military culture emphasized following orders and executing plans as designed. American military culture, particularly in armored units, emphasized initiative and adapting to circumstances. The M18 crews embodied this American approach. They had doctrine and training, but they also had latitude to exploit opportunities. A platoon leader, like Lieutenant Leiper, could make tactical decisions in real time without requesting permission from higher headquarters. If he saw an opportunity to engage German armor from an unexpected angle, he could execute immediately. This decentralized decision-making, combined with vehicle capabilities that rewarded initiative, created tactical tempo that German forces struggled to counter. Beyond the tactical level, the M18's success validated broader American military-industrial capabilities. The United States produced 2,507 M18 Hellcats between July 1943 and October 1944. Germany produced approximately 5,964 Panther tanks over a longer period. The M18 cost $57,500 per unit. The Panther cost substantially more and required far more manufacturing resources. The American advantage wasn't just numerical production. It was production of vehicles that matched tactical requirements. The M18 wasn't the most heavily armed American armored vehicle. It wasn't the most heavily armored, but it was optimized for the specific mission of tank destruction using American tactical doctrine. Speed and mobility over armor, flanking attacks over frontal engagements, initiative and flexibility over systematic execution. The M18 embodied a coherent philosophy of warfare. German tank production, conversely, increasingly emphasized vehicles that were engineering marvels but tactical nightmares. The Tiger II tank mounted the most powerful tank gun of the war and had virtually impenetrable frontal armor. It was also mechanically unreliable, consumed fuel at extraordinary rates, and was so heavy that many European bridges couldn't support it. The Tiger II represented German faith that superior engineering and firepower would overcome numerical disadvantages. The M18 represented American faith that adequate firepower, combined with superior mobility and numbers, would overwhelm technically superior opponents. Arracourt demonstrated which philosophy worked better in practice. The Germans brought technically superior tanks. The Americans brought adequate tanks employed with superior tactics and operational tempo. The Germans lost decisively. This pattern would repeat throughout the final year of the war. German technical advantages in individual weapons systems became increasingly irrelevant as American advantages in logistics, air power, numbers, and tactical flexibility accumulated. The crews who fought in M18 Hellcats understood they were part of something unusual. They knew their vehicle was exceptional. They knew their tactics worked. Many retained pride in their service with Tank Destroyer Battalions for decades after the war. Reunions of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion brought together veterans who had fought at Arracourt. Their stories consistently emphasized the same themes: the speed of the M18, the fear of being hit, the satisfaction of destroying German armor that supposedly couldn't be touched by American guns, the pride in having proven that speed and initiative could triumph over armor and firepower. The German tank crews who survived encounters with M18s carried different memories. For them, the Hellcat represented the moment when German technical superiority stopped mattering, when the tanks that were supposed to be invincible proved vulnerable, when doctrine that had worked for 5 years suddenly failed. The psychological impact extended beyond individual engagements. If Panthers could be destroyed by thin-skinned American tank destroyers, what did German armor superiority actually mean? If superior guns and armor didn't guarantee victory, what advantage did German forces retain? These questions didn't have comfortable answers for German commanders in late 1944. The truth was that individual technical advantages mattered less than systemic capabilities. The Americans had more tanks, more fuel, more spare parts, better logistics, air superiority, and increasingly, tactical competence that matched or exceeded German capabilities. The M18 Hellcat's success at Arracourt wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how American material and tactical advantages were converging to make German defensive positions untenable. The legacy of the M18 Hellcat extended beyond World War II. Tank Destroyer doctrine, vindicated by Hellcat performance, influenced post-war armored vehicle development. The principle that mobility and firepower could substitute for armor protection shaped subsequent designs. Modern armored warfare still debates these trade-offs. Main battle tanks emphasize protection. Infantry fighting vehicles emphasize mobility. Tank destroyers as a separate category largely disappeared, but the philosophy that produced the M18 persists. The specific engagements around Arracourt entered military education as case studies. The Battle of Arracourt is taught at armor schools as an example of how inferior forces can defeat superior opponents through better tactics, better use of terrain, better coordination with supporting arms, and better exploitation of technological capabilities. The lesson isn't that speed always beats armor. The lesson is that matching tactical employment to vehicle capabilities matters more than raw technical specifications. For the German tank crews who faced M18s in September 1944, there was no lesson beyond survival. They had been told their Panthers were superior to any American tank. They had been trained that their firepower and armor would prevail. Then they encountered opponents who refused to fight the kind of battle German doctrine assumed. Opponents who appeared from unexpected directions, fired, and vanished before return fire was possible. Opponents who turned German advantages into irrelevancies by simply not being where German guns could shoot them. The morning of September 19th, 1944 began with German confidence. The 113th Panzer Brigade advanced toward Arracourt, expecting to destroy an isolated American force. By afternoon, the brigade had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting unit. In the fog and chaos of that morning, German tank doctrine collided with American tank destroyer doctrine. The Germans brought superior weapons. The Americans brought superior tactics. The outcome wasn't close. Lieutenant Leiper and his M18 crews survived that engagement. They fought throughout the rest of the Lorraine campaign. They participated in the advance into Germany. They saw the war through to its conclusion. Years later, when Leiper told the story of that foggy September morning, he emphasized not the technical details of combat, but the moment when he realized they could win. When he understood that speed mattered more than armor, when he saw German Panthers, supposedly invincible, burning in the fields around Réchicourt-la-Petite. That moment represented more than one lieutenant's tactical revelation. It represented the moment when American armored forces fully understood their own capabilities. When they stopped being intimidated by German technical superiority. When they realized that the way they fought mattered more than what they fought with. The M18 Hellcat didn't win the war. No single weapon system wins wars. But it demonstrated that American doctrine, American tactics, and American industrial capability could produce weapons optimized for the kind of warfare America needed to fight. The German tank crews never expected the M18 Hellcat. They expected Shermans. They expected frontal engagements. They expected battles where German firepower and armor advantages would determine outcomes. They didn't expect opponents who appeared at 55 miles per hour, fired from flanking angles, and vanished before return fire was possible. That unexpected opponent cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of tanks and contributed to the collapse of German defences in eastern France. Sometimes the weapon you don't expect is more dangerous than the weapon you do. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.